At the beginning of the 17th century, much of Europe was governed by centralized monarchies. Political authority was concentrated. Economic life was largely agrarian. Religious conflict shaped public life. Yet in the northwestern corner of the continent, a different model was emerging: the Dutch Republic. In 1581, 7 provinces formally declared independence from the Spanish crown during the 80 Years' War. Although full recognition would come later, the 12 Years' Truce beginning in 1609 created a period of relative stability. Independence alone does not explain what followed. What made the Dutch Republic structurally distinct was its institutional design. There was no dominant monarch directing economic life. Political authority was distributed among provincial estates and urban regions, many of whom were merchants. Commercial interests were not peripheral to governance, they were embedded within it. This alignment between political authority and mercantile priorities produced a different incentive structure. Markets were not tolerated reluctantly, they were actively cultivated. The Dutch Republic did not possess vast territory. Its population around 1630 is estimated at roughly 1.5 to 2 million people. Yet its merchant fleet was extraordinary. Historical estimates suggest that between 40 and 50% of European maritime transport was Dutch-controlled. Amsterdam emerged as the central port of northern Europe. Grain imports from the Baltic, often described as the mother trade, provided stable food supplies at relatively predictable prices. This stability had consequences. When food is affordable and supply chains are reliable, households retain surplus income. Surplus enables discretionary consumption, and discretionary consumption supports luxury markets. By early 17th century standards, Dutch GDP per capita ranked among the highest in the world. Some reconstructions suggest it exceeded that of many European regions by a substantial margin. This was not an economy operating at subsistence. It was diversified, commercialized, international. Economic prosperity alone, however, does not produce financial complexity. Institutions do. In 1602, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, was established. It allowed investors to purchase permanent shares in a trading enterprise that operated across Asia. Capital was pooled, risk was distributed, ownership became divisible. Shares could be resold. This feature transformed investment from a static commitment into a transferable asset. To facilitate exchange, trading activity consolidated in what became known as the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. There, ownership was continuously priced. Expectations about voyages, cargo returns, and geopolitical developments influenced valuation. Risk was interpreted through price. The idea that the future could be valued and exchanged began to normalize. Monetary stability reinforced this system. In 1609, the Bank of Amsterdam was founded. European commerce at the time suffered from inconsistent coinage. Multiple currencies circulated simultaneously, often with uncertain metallic content. Large transactions carried monetary ambiguity. The bank introduced standardized accounting units backed by precious metals. This reduced uncertainty. Predictable settlement lowered transaction costs. Lower transaction costs encouraged higher transaction volume.
stability in this context did not constrain markets, it expanded them. Urbanization intensified these dynamics. By approximately 1620, more than half of the Dutch population lived in cities, an unusually high proportion for the period. Urban environments concentrate exchange. Exchange relies on contracts. Contracts depend on trust. Literacy rates were comparatively high. Commercial disputes were adjudicated in functioning civil courts. Information circulated through print culture and merchant correspondence. Social mobility, while not unlimited, was more fluid than in many contemporary monarchies. Status was not determined solely by inherited title. Commercial success could elevate position. Visible wealth carried social meaning. Luxury goods became markers of distinction within an urban, competitive society. When status can be signaled through acquisition, demand for scarce objects acquires additional layers of motivation. By the mid-1630s, the Dutch Republic combined several reinforcing characteristics: economic surplus, active trade networks, structured financial markets, monetary reliability, contract enforcement, and political institutions aligned with commerce. None of these features are inherently destabilizing. They are typically associated with development. Yet systems that efficiently mobilize capital also reduce barriers to speculative activity. When contracts are easy to formalize, when liquidity is available, when prior innovations have rewarded calculated risk, optimism can become structurally encouraged. Participants do not need to abandon rationality. They only need to respond to incentives within a highly functional system. The Dutch Republic had built one of the most advanced commercial environments of its time. Markets operated, capital moved, trust circulated. Within such a system, attention naturally seeks focal points. Scarcity attracts interest. Interest invites valuation. Valuation invites exchange. In this environment, even an object initially valued for aesthetic curiosity could gradually acquire financial significance. The structures were already in place. They did not need to change. They only needed something new to price.
By the early 17th century, the Dutch Republic had not only accumulated wealth, it had constructed mechanisms for organizing capital with unusual sophistication. These mechanisms were not theoretical innovations. They emerged from practical commercial needs. Yet together they created a financial environment in which ownership, risk, and expectation could circulate with increasing efficiency. In 1602, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, was established. It introduced a structural innovation. Investors could purchase permanent shares in a company financing long-distance trade with Asia. Unlike earlier ventures, capital was not liquidated after a single expedition. Ownership continued over time. The company raised approximately 6.5 million guilders in its initial offering, a substantial amount for the period. More important than the scale of capital was the principle of transferability. Shares could be resold. This created liquidity. Ownership was no longer fixed to the original investor. It became mobile. Trading activity gathered around what became known as the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. There, shares changed hands with increasing regularity. Prices fluctuated in response to news about voyages, cargo arrivals, geopolitical tensions, and maritime risk.
uncertainty became visible through price movement. Market participants learned to interpret the future probabilistically. Over time, practices emerged that would later become familiar features of modern finance. Forward agreements, short sales, transactions structured around anticipated developments. Merchants were not only exchanging goods, they were exchanging expectations. Value became linked not only to present possession, but to projected outcomes. Time entered financial calculation as a variable that could be priced. Monetary stability reinforced this environment. In 1609, the Bank of Amsterdam was founded to address a persistent problem: inconsistent coinage circulating across Europe. Coins differed in metallic content. Debasement was common. Large payments involved uncertainty about intrinsic value. The bank required deposits in precious metal and credited standardized bank money in return. This accounting unit was stable. Predictable settlement reduced friction. Reduced friction increased transactional volume. Stability, in this context, functioned as an enabling condition for expansion. Alongside these developments, forward contracting became increasingly common in commodity markets. Grain, herring, and spices were frequently sold for delivery at a future date, with prices fixed in advance. For producers, this reduced revenue volatility. For merchants, it secured supply and protected margins. The instrument was rational and commercially efficient. Yet forward contracts introduced a structural shift. They allowed claims on goods to circulate independently of immediate physical exchange. A contract promising future delivery could itself be transferred. Expectations become separable from the underlying commodity. Once expectations are tradable, they can acquire momentum independent of physical supply. By the mid-1630s, Amsterdam functioned not only as a trading hub, but as a financial center. Urban literacy rates were comparatively high. Commercial disputes were resolved in civil courts, which generally enforced contractual obligations. Trust in legal enforcement was credible. Participants in these markets were experienced. They were accustomed to risk, to fluctuating prices, to delayed outcomes. This was not a society unfamiliar with uncertainty. It was one that had normalized the pricing of uncertainty. By the mid-1630s, the financial system displayed reinforcing characteristics. Liquidity allowed entry and exit with relative ease. Certain contracts required limited upfront capital relative to total value, introducing implicit leverage. Institutional trust supported the expectation that agreements would be honored. When these elements coexist, markets become efficient at transmitting information. But efficiency also increases responsiveness to changes in collective expectations. A system capable of pricing the future can amplify optimism as readily as it can register caution. The mechanisms developed for trading shares and commodities did not depend on the nature of the asset itself. They depended on structure. Once a system is capable of organizing expectation into contracts, the range of tradable objects can expand. The infrastructure was mature. Ownership was divisible. Contracts were enforceable. Prices adjusted continuously. Credit circulated. Under such conditions, it was not necessary for a new asset to possess intrinsic productivity. It only needed scarcity, recognizability, and the possibility of resale. The financial architecture was already in place. It did not need to change. It only needed something else to trade.
The tulip did not originate in the Dutch Republic. Its botanical origins trace back to Central Asia.
By the 16th century, it was cultivated extensively within the Ottoman Empire, where it became associated with refinement and elite culture. In 1554, Ogier de Busbecq, ambassador of the Holy Roman Emperor to Constantinople, sent tulip bulbs to Europe. Several decades later, in 1593, the botanist Carolus Clusius was appointed director of the Botanical Garden at Leiden University. There, he began cultivating tulips systematically. His objective was scientific. He was cataloguing and studying an exotic species. Yet demand began to emerge almost immediately. Historical accounts suggest that bulbs were removed from his garden without authorization. Whether exaggerated or not, these incidents indicate that interest extended beyond academic circles. Scarcity accompanied the flower from its earliest presence in the Republic. Tulips possess biological characteristics that would later prove economically significant. They reproduce slowly. A bulb planted in autumn produces a flower in spring. Under typical conditions, it divides only once per year. This imposes a natural constraint on supply expansion. Unlike manufactured goods or agricultural crops that can be scaled seasonally, tulip propagation follows a biological rhythm. There was an additional factor. The most coveted varieties displayed intricate streaks and flame-like patterns. At the time, these patterns were considered aesthetic anomalies. Modern science attributes them to infection by the tulip-breaking virus. The virus disrupted pigmentation, producing striking visual contrasts. These broken tulips were rare, not because supply was deliberately restricted, but because the biological condition that created them was unpredictable and fragile. Scarcity, in this case, was organic. It could not be accelerated easily in response to rising prices. During the early decades of the 1630s, tulips were cultivated primarily by botanists and affluent collectors. They functioned as objects of curiosity and prestige. Gradually, however, their circulation widened. Illustrated catalogues began to appear. Specific varieties were assigned distinct names: Semper Augustus, Viceroy, Admiral. Naming performs an economic function. It transforms variation into category. A category can be compared. It can be ranked. It can be differentiated. Once standardized through naming and depiction, tulips became identifiable units within exchange networks. In an urban society where commercial achievement shaped social standing, possession of rare varieties carried symbolic value. They were portable, they were visible, they were limited. They resembled collectible artifacts. And collectibles, when scarce and culturally valued, often experience price appreciation. Notarial records indicate that prices began increasing gradually before the height of speculative activity. Common varieties might sell for 10 to 50 guilders. For context, a skilled artisan might earn between 200 and 300 guilders annually. Rare varieties reached far higher valuations. Certain documented contracts place a single Semper Augustus bulb at more than 5,000 guilders. Such figures did not represent the entire market. The tulip trade was stratified. But the presence of these high valuations demonstrated a premium segment exerted. Price escalation did not occur in a single moment. It developed through incremental appreciation. Each transaction provided reference for the next.
A structural transformation occurred when tulips transitioned from physical goods to contractual claims. Bulbs could only be lifted from the ground during a limited seasonal window, typically between early summer and early autumn. Yet trading intensified during winter months when bulbs remained planted. This meant that many transactions involved future delivery agreements. Participants purchased rights to receive a bulb at a later date. The flower remained underground. The contract circulated above ground. This separation altered market dynamics. When an asset becomes primarily a claim rather than an object in hand, exchange can expand beyond immediate biological constraints. The tulip did not cease to be horticultural, but it acquired an additional layer. It became a negotiable instrument. It is important to emphasize that these developments did not require widespread irrationality. Supply was genuinely limited. Demand was supported by status incentives. Contracts were formalized and often notarized. Prices had risen consistently over several years. For a merchant operating in the mid-1630s, participation could appear coherent with prior profitable ventures. The Dutch financial system had already demonstrated that scarce assets, when correctly positioned, could yield substantial gains. Tulips differed, however, in one crucial respect. They generated no income stream, no dividends, no freight returns, no productive yield. Their valuation depended entirely on the expectation of resale. As long as buyers anticipated future buyers at higher prices, the structure could remain stable. But when valuation rests exclusively on expectation, confidence becomes central. Small changes in sentiment can produce disproportionate adjustments. By 1636, the tulip had evolved from botanical curiosity to structured asset. Named variety circulated in written agreements. Forward contracts were common. Prices in certain segments had reached levels comparable to significant real property. The mechanisms that governed shares and commodities were now operating around a flower. Trading gradually extended beyond botanical gardens and established merchant networks. Agreements were concluded in taverns, private gatherings, and local meeting places. Participation widened. Liquidity increased. The biological limits of the plant remained unchanged, but the financial activity surrounding it began to operate on a different scale.
Tulips bloom in spring. Bulbs can only be removed from the ground during a narrow window between early summer and early autumn. Yet the most intense trading activity did not occur during harvest season. It occurred in winter, particularly between November 1636 and January 1637. During those months, the bulbs remained buried. What circulated instead were agreements. Participants traded the right to receive a specific bulb at a predetermined future date. The physical asset stayed underground. The contract moved between hands. This shift was not incidental. It allowed transactions to expand beyond the biological tempo of the plant itself. A tulip could only divide once per year. A contract referencing that tulip could change owners repeatedly within weeks. The underlying scarcity remained constant. The financial velocity increased. Unlike shares of the Dutch East India Company, tulip contracts were not traded on the official Amsterdam exchange. Transactions took place in informal gatherings known as collegia. These meetings often occurred in taverns in cities as Haarlem,
Amsterdam, and Alkmaar. Buyers and sellers assembled, varieties were announced, bids were made, agreements were recorded, sometimes in the presence of witnesses. The structure was recognizable, but it operated outside the formal securities infrastructure. A typical contract required only a small initial payment, in some cases between 2 and 5% of the total value. The remainder was due upon delivery. This arrangement introduced implicit leverage. With limited capital, a participant could control a high-value asset. If the price rose before settlement, the contract itself could be resold at a profit. The original buyer did not need to take physical possession. Profit could be realized through transfer of the agreement. Lower entry requirements widened participation. Higher turnover increased liquidity. Liquidity reinforced price movement. Contemporaries referred to this activity as windhandel, trade in wind. The phrase described the nature of the exchange. Until delivery, nothing tangible changed hands. Value was anchored in expectation. In January 1637, certain documented contracts reached extraordinary levels. The variety known as Viceroy traded around 2,500 guilders in some records. Semper Augustus was recorded at figures exceeding 5,000 guilders. For context, a modest house in Amsterdam might cost between 1,500 and 3,000 guilders. A skilled artisan might earn 200 to 300 guilders annually. These extreme prices did not represent the entire market. Most varieties traded at far lower levels. But marginal transactions influence perception disproportionately. High prices establish reference points. Reference points alter expectations. Expectations shape bidding behavior. Popular accounts later suggested that farmers and laborers mortgaged their livelihoods to speculate in tulips. Archival research paints a narrower picture. Participation appears to have been concentrated among merchants, skilled artisans, and members of the urban middle class. The network was commercial, not agrarian. The number of documented participants was modest relative to the scale of the Dutch economy. This concentration is significant. It implies that exposure was not systemic in the modern sense. The broader financial structure of the Republic was not entirely dependent on tulip contracts. The phenomenon was intense but localized. The incentive structure was straightforward. Prices rose. Contracts required minimal initial capital. Buyers could resell agreements before delivery. Rising prices validated prior purchases. Each transaction reinforced the plausibility of the next. No widespread deception was necessary. The mechanism depended on continuity. As long as each participant believed a subsequent buyer would appear, valuation could remain elevated. But the tulip differed from shares in a trading company. It generated no income stream, no dividends, no freight revenues, no productive output. Its price was justified solely by anticipated resale. In such a system, confidence is not peripheral, it is central. When leverage is present and intrinsic yield is absent, stability depends almost entirely on shared belief in ongoing liquidity. By January 1637, trading volumes in several cities had visibly increased. Reports indicate that some of the highest prices occurred precisely at this stage. Yet the contractual framework contained a structural vulnerability. Many agreements relied more on reputation than on substantial collateral. Formal enforcement mechanisms were limited. As long as buyers continued to appear, these weaknesses remained dormant. Liquidity concealed fragility. But in markets governed primarily by expectation, equilibrium can shift quickly. No large external shock is required. A small failure at the margin can alter perception. And when perception changes, liquidity can contract faster than it expanded.
The episode most frequently cited occurred on February 3, 1637, in the city of Haarlem. At what appears to have been a routine auction, several lots of tulips failed to attract buyers at the expected prices. There are no records of disorder, no reports of panic in the streets. There were simply no acceptable bids. In a market structured around anticipated resale, the absence of a buyer is not neutral. It alters probability. If an asset's valuation depends on the expectation that it can be resold at a higher price, then a failed auction introduces new information, not dramatic information, but decisive information. In notarial records from February 1637, tides have alone. In a city, notarial records from February 1637, tides have alone. In a city where the future of every exchange depended on further trade, even a minor hiccup resembled a panic. There are no records of disorder, no reports of panic in the streets. There were simply no acceptable bids. In a market structured around anticipated resale, the absence of a buyer is not neutral. It alters probability. If an asset's valuation depends on the expectation that it can be resold at a higher price, then a failed auction introduces new information, not dramatic information, but decisive information. Tulip contracts functioned on the assumption that positions could be transferred before physical delivery in summer. If buyers hesitated in one of the principal trading cities, the rational calculation changed immediately. Without resale, the holder of a contract would be obligated to pay the full agreed price upon delivery. If price appreciation stalled, the incentive to maintain the position weakened. No collective hysteria was required, only a downward revision in the perceived likelihood of finding the next purchaser. Because most contracts required only a small deposit, often between 2 and 5%, the financial exposure was asymmetric. As long as prices rose, leverage amplified gains. Once expectations reversed, the same leverage amplified the incentive to default. When the expected future price falls below the contracted price, forfeiting the deposit can become economically rational. Notarial records from February 1637 indicate rapid price adjustments. There is no continuous statistical series, but surviving contracts suggest substantial declines within weeks. Varieties that had traded at several thousand guilders struggled to find buyers at those levels. It is important to be precise. Prices did not uniformly collapse to zero. Rather, the secondary market thinned dramatically. And without an active secondary market, forward contracts lose practical function. If a claim cannot be transferred, it reverts to a simple obligation to purchase. In that environment, many obligations no longer appeared attractive. The central issue was liquidity. Tulips produced no income, no dividends, no freight revenues, no productive yield. Their value was sustained by continuous exchange. Once exchange slowed, valuation became indeterminate. The adjustment did not necessarily resemble an explosion. It resembled a withdrawal. Transactions became sporadic. Bid-ask spreads widened. In modern terms, it approximated a liquidity shock.
Without buyers, prices cease to be discoverable. As spring approached, contract holders faced a choice: honor the agreement and pay the full contracted price, or decline performance and forfeit the initial deposit. Given that deposits were small relative to total contract value, non-performance often represented the lower cost option. The contractual structure that had enabled expansion now facilitated exit. This was not necessarily widespread deception. It was incentive-driven behavior under altered expectations. When market price falls below contracted price, default probability rises. Later narratives portrayed the event as a national economic catastrophe. Archival evidence suggests a more contained impact. There were no systemic bank failures in 1637. The Bank of Amsterdam continued operations. Maritime trade did not collapse. The broader Dutch economy remained functional. Losses were real for those directly involved, but exposure appears to have been concentrated within specific commercial networks. The tulip market was intense. It was not economy-wide in scale. The structural pattern is consistent with other expectation-driven markets. No war was required, no epidemic, no external invasion, only a shift in marginal belief. When valuation depends almost entirely on confidence in future resale, stability is inherently conditional. As soon as expected gains no longer compensate for perceived risk, participation contracts. And when participation contracts in a leveraged environment, prices adjust rapidly. The tulip did not change. Biological scarcity remained. What changed was the willingness to treat expectation as reliable collateral.
By the spring of 1637, the central issue was no longer price. Secondary trading had largely stalled. Yet the calendar continued to move forward. In summer, bulbs would be lifted from the ground. Contracts signed months earlier were approaching settlement. What had been a matter of market valuation became a legal question. Were these agreements fully enforceable in court? If courts required buyers to honor contracts at previously agreed prices, sometimes amounting to thousands of guilders, a number of participants would likely face insolvency. If contracts were broadly invalidated, however, the credibility of commercial enforcement could be weakened. The dilemma was institutional. Strict enforcement risked concentrated financial distress. Non-enforcement risked reputational damage to the Republic's legal framework. The contractual nature of many tulip transactions introduced ambiguity. Numerous agreements had been concluded in taverns, recorded before witnesses, but not always notarized through formal channels. Many involved winter trading of bulbs still embedded in the ground, with delivery months away. This left room for reinterpretation. Municipal authorities in several cities deliberated during the spring of 1637 on how to address disputes emerging from non-performance. The objective was not to determine botanical value, it was to preserve commercial stability. The resolution that gradually emerged was pragmatic. Rather than uniformly compelling full contractual performance, many local authorities allowed agreements to be treated effectively as options. Buyers were permitted to cancel contracts in exchange for paying a relatively small penalty. In some municipal resolutions, this penalty was set at approximately 3.5% of the nominal contract value. A contract of 2,000 guilders under such terms could be terminated for around 70 guilders.
This transformed potentially ruinous liabilities into limited losses. The adjustment did not erase consequences, it capped them. The structural effects were significant. Large-scale litigation was reduced. Financial contagion was contained. Obligations were redefined in a way that prevented cascading insolvencies. There were no state bailouts in the modern sense, no nationalizations, no suspension of the broader commercial system. The Bank of Amsterdam continued operations. The Dutch East India Company did not collapse. Maritime trade proceeded. The exposure had been fragmented rather than concentrated within core financial institutions. Because risk was dispersed across private participants and not embedded within systemic banking structures, the shock proved absorbable. Losses were real, particularly for those who had entered the market at elevated price levels. But the historical record does not support the image of nationwide economic devastation. Modern archival research suggests that the number of active participants was limited relative to a population estimated between 1.5 and 2 million. The episode was intense within certain commercial circles. It did not paralyze the Dutch economy. Urban growth, trade expansion, and financial innovation continued in subsequent decades. What stands out is not merely that a speculative market corrected, it is how the institutional framework adapted. Authorities displayed flexibility without dismantling the broader principle of contractual reliability. They avoided setting a precedent that all commercial losses would be socialized. At the same time, they prevented rigid enforcement from generating systemic instability. The market mechanism was not repudiated, it was recalibrated. There is a structural paradox here. A sophisticated financial environment enabled the rapid expansion of a speculative market. That same institutional sophistication allowed for its containment. The episode did not destroy the Dutch Republic's commercial credibility. If anything, it demonstrated the resilience of its legal and financial architecture. The tulip market contracted. The system endured.
The story most widely repeated is straightforward. Citizens mortgaging homes to purchase bulbs, farmers ruined, a national economy devastated by collective madness. This version has endured for centuries, yet much of it solidified decades after 1637. The episode was gradually reframed as a moral parable about greed, excess, and irrational exuberance. The more difficult question is empirical. What do contemporary records actually show? Surviving notarial contracts confirm that elevated transactions occurred. Certain exceptional varieties surpassed 5,000 guilders in documented agreements, but these cases were rare. They were concentrated among specific collectors and commercial networks. Modern archival research has significantly revised the scale of the phenomenon. In the 21st century, historian Anne Goldgar conducted extensive analysis of municipal and notarial archives. Her findings suggest that participation was limited and socially concentrated. The number of individuals directly involved appears small relative to a population estimated between 1.5 and 2 million. There is no solid evidence of widespread bankruptcies across the Republic, no documentation of systemic banking collapse, no indication that the national economy entered prolonged contraction as a result of tulip trading. The losses were real, they were not economy-wide.
After the market contracted, satirical pamphlets and engravings circulated. Some depicted monkeys dressed as merchants exchanging tulips. The imagery was pointed. It framed the episode as absurdity. But satire is not statistical reporting. The Dutch Republic possessed a vibrant print culture. Pamphlets were inexpensive, polemical, and widely distributed. Exaggeration attracted attention. Within a society shaped by Calvinist moral sensibilities, speculative excess could be interpreted as ethical disorder. The tulip became a convenient symbol. A flower priced at thousands of guilders was visually memorable. It lent itself to allegory. Over time, the allegory hardened into accepted narrative. In the 18th century, commentators placed the tulip episode alongside the South Sea Bubble of 1720. Later economic writers cited it as an early example of financial mania. But structural comparison reveals meaningful differences. The South Sea Bubble entangled British public debt and large segments of national finance. Tulip contracts were private agreements concerning an ornamental good. The scale of systemic exposure was not comparable. The tulip episode was dramatic in price movement. It was limited in macroeconomic reach. Financial crises often become moral stories because moral stories are transmissible. Human greed is a concise explanation. Incentive structures, seasonal liquidity constraints, and implicit leverage is analytically stronger but less accessible. Narratives simplify, systems complicate. The tulip endured in cultural memory precisely because it was concrete, a flower, a price, an image of excess. Balance sheets and contractual clauses lack the same symbolic force. Was it the first financial bubble? It is arguably the first well-documented speculative episode within a modern commercial economy that preserved detailed contractual records. But it was not the largest, not the most destructive, not the most systemic. Its historical importance lies elsewhere. It demonstrated that in a sophisticated financial environment, prices can temporarily detach from functional utility when expectation becomes the dominant driver of valuation, and it showed that such detachment does not automatically produce national ruin. Recent historiography reframes the event in measured terms. It was real. It involved speculation. Prices in certain segments reached extraordinary levels, yet participation was limited. Institutional containment was effective. Macroeconomic continuity persisted. The more relevant question, therefore, is not how an entire society succumbed to irrationality. It is structural. What configuration of incentives allowed rapid price escalation and then permitted rapid contraction without systemic collapse? When examined through that lens, the tulip episode becomes less a tale of madness and more a case study in how expectation-driven markets operate within institutional boundaries.
If the tulip is removed from the story as a physical object, what remains is structure. A scarce or desirable asset. Contracts that allow purchase today and payment later. Sufficient liquidity to enable rapid resale. Confidence that a future buyer will appear. That configuration did not belong exclusively to 1637. It is a recurring architecture. The object changes. The mechanism does not. In 1720, the South Sea Company in Britain combined tradable shares, public debt conversion, and rising expectations of overseas wealth. In 1929, American equities were widely purchased on margin, with investors committing only a fraction of total value. In 2000, technology firms with limited or negative earnings traded primarily on projected growth.
In 2008, mortgage-linked securities circulated under the assumption that housing liquidity would remain continuous. The scale differed. The instruments grew more complex. The underlying logic remained consistent. When expectation becomes the dominant input into price, feedback loops intensify. Leverage is central to that feedback. During the tulip trade, deposits often represented only 2 to 5% of contract value. In 1929, margin requirements could fall near 10%. Leverage is not inherently destabilizing. It increases capital efficiency when price trajectories are stable. It magnifies gains, but it also compresses tolerance for reversal. When prices decline, leveraged positions reach break-even quickly. Incentives shift rapidly from participation to exit. Liquidity functions as the system's stabilizer until it does not. Liquidity is the ability to convert an asset into cash without materially altering its price. In the Dutch Republic, as long as buyers were present, tulip contracts retained value. The failed auction in February 1637 revealed a simple principle. Liquidity is not permanent, it is conditional. When participation thins, price discovery becomes impaired. When price discovery falters, valuation becomes uncertain. Under those conditions, even scarce assets can experience abrupt repricing. Each participant in late 1636 operated under intelligible incentives. Acquire a scarce good, resell at a higher price, commit limited upfront capital. These actions were consistent with prior commercial experience. Speculative episodes do not require collective irrationality. They require systems in which future expectation is capitalized into present price. When valuation depends more on anticipated resale than on underlying utility or income generation, sensitivity to marginal information increases. Small signals can produce large adjustments. The distinguishing feature of 1637 was institutional containment. The market was relatively segmented. Systemic banking institutions were not deeply exposed. Local authorities reinterpreted contracts in ways that capped losses without dismantling commercial credibility. The Bank of Amsterdam continued operations. Maritime trade proceeded. Financial innovation did not reverse. Speculation was absorbed rather than amplified into national crisis. This highlights a structural distinction. Not every bubble becomes systemic. The degree of integration with core credit structures determines the magnitude of impact. Abstracted further, the pattern is recognizable. An attractive innovation or scarce asset, expansion of liquidity, normalization of leverage, broad confidence in continuous resale, a marginal negative signal, withdrawal of liquidity, rapid repricing. The sequence does not assign moral fault. It describes emergent dynamics within market systems. The tulip episode was not merely a story about an expensive flower. It was an early documented instance of a modern financial system encountering the consequences of its own efficiency. Sophisticated contracts facilitated growth. The same contracts enabled speculative acceleration. When confidence adjusted, the structure corrected. The republic endured. The record remained. What persists is not the tulip, it is the pattern linking liquidity, leverage, expectation, and institutional response. As long as markets transform future belief into present price, that pattern will remain relevant, not as anomaly, but as possibility inherent in financial systems themselves.